Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Lynn Nesbitt, and I'm chairing today's panel. Joining me on the panel are Doug Marks and Linda McFadden, joining us via Zoom. Our administrative personnel is Fran Picoto, and our assessor is Sharon Tang. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. Statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the Board's order. Opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the Board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing items 1 and 2, 4, 5, and 6, and 8 on our docket today. Ms. Picoto, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
Madam Assessor, please state your full name.
Sharon Tang.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Ashara Abbas.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, Ms. Tang and Mr. Abbas.
Good morning.
So let's start right in with our docket today. This is item number 1, file number 24-2088, 42 Langside Street. And just confirming, Mr. Abbas, this is an appeal of the assessed value?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Tang, you may go ahead with your evidence, please.
File number is 24-2088. Roll number is 1209077300. Address is 42 Lanside Street. The assessed value for 2025 is $1,340,000. The building has 3 stories. It was built in 1911 with an effective year built of 1952. There are 13 suites, no parking. Page 2 and 3 shows the subject property photos and locations. And page 5 shows the evaluation. So there are 6 one-bedrooms, 7 two-bedrooms, and we use a monthly rent of $938.38. Then we use 3.6% vacancy, 50.64% expense ratio, and 5.2% cap rate. And that gives us $1,340,000. Page 6 shows the comparable rent and locations. 7 and 8 shows the cap rate studies. We use the 3 years historical income prior to the date of sale to calculate the NOI to determine the cap rate on page 8. And page 14 is the subject property income and expense information. And 15 to the remaining of the brief shows the subject property photos. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Abbas, questions for the assessor?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you. Ms. Tang, so I'm looking at the exterior photo of the subject on page 2. Would you agree that the property's exterior is in its original condition?
I'm sorry, what was your question again?
Is the exterior of our subject property is in its original condition?
I believe so.
And then can you confirm that the model uses effective age of the property while generating the value?
That'll be based on the effective year built, which would be 1952.
But you would agree that the foundational and structural age of the property is still 1910.
That is correct.
Now, I'm looking at your rent comps on page 6. Are all those rent comps actual rents that you've used or estimated?
My understanding is their actual rent.
Okay. So a follow-up question to that would be, so you're using actual rents from other apartments, but are you considering the actual rents of our subject property?
Um, I don't believe so.
Okay. That is okay. And then my last question would be that your comp 1, I'm noticing that it has a higher average monthly rent. Would you agree that because there are more two-bedroom units than one bedroom, that the average monthly rent is skewed because of that? Because typically a two-bedroom would rent for a higher price than one bedrooms.
I agree.
Okay. That was all my questions, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Mr. Marks, questions for the assessor?
No, my question's been asked and answered. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. McFadden?
Just to confirm, Ms. Tang, this is a model generated assessment.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Tang, your rent comparables, how were these selected, or what, maybe my question is, why were they selected? Why these particular ones?
So when I'm selecting the comparables, I'll be filtering out the effective year built and the total suite number of suites, and the locations and the zoning for the properties as well. So there are some properties that come up, and then these 4 are selected because they're in the same area. They're in the same around the same year built, and they have the similar condition compared to the subject property as well. So I'm just showing that there's a range for properties in similar conditions for the rent.
Okay. 3 of your 4 comparables have lower rents than than the subject. Only one has, well, all 4 actually are lower. Am I looking at the right line? Sorry. No, only one is a little bit higher, the rest are lower. Can you speak to that? I'm wondering, is that a function of the suite mix, or I see that comp 3, 4, and 5, they're predominantly 1 bedrooms. One is $40 more on average and the other one is $100 or less or greater.
Yeah, so if you're looking at the gross floor area per unit, the space is also like I guess the square footage is also lower compared to the
So-
subject property.
So they're smaller units, that's what you're saying?
Yes, so if you're looking at price per square footage, I should have included in my brief, but the subject property has a price per square foot of 95 cents per square foot. Comparable one has about $1 per square foot. Comparable two has about 94 cents per square foot. Comparable three has about 97 cents per square foot. And comparable four has $1.02 per square foot. So that would support the subject property rent.
So you are suggesting then they are actually more comparable than they look when you just look at the rent.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. That's helpful for me. Okay, I have no additional questions. So Mr. Abbas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if you turn to page 2, I provided some of the facts of the property as well as requested our requested assessment on the bottom, which is $1,015,000. We note that this property was originally built in 1911 and has an effective age of 1952 assigned to it. If you further scroll down to page 6, I have an aerial map view and then a Google map view of the location, and then an exterior photo of the subject property on page 8. On page 9, there's a brief description which tells us that our subject property is located on the west side of Langside between Westminster and Cornish Avenue and is currently being used as a multifamily apartment. Further to that, it tells that there are 13 units in total, including 6 one-bedroom and 7 two-bedroom units. Now, if I may request the board to please scroll to page 17, where I have provided our income and expense valuation. Is everyone on page 17?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Abbas.
Thank you. So we are disputing the assessor's market gross rents of 146,000 that I have highlighted in a column towards the right side. It's highlighted in light green color as well. We are applying a potential market gross rents of 140,400 or $900 per suite per month based on the actual stabilized income of the subject property. We further then have adjusted, we have applied a 3.6% vacancy and added the laundry income, the most recent laundry income, which was 1,285, and we come up to an effective gross income of 136,631 compared to city's 141,117 dollars. Further, for the expense allowance, we are disputing assessor's expense allowance of 71,462, and we have applied an expense allowance of 73,217, which is quite close to what the city has applied. Our expense ratio comes down to 53.6% based off the expenses that we have used, and we have used the actual expenses that have been reported by the owner in their INEs, and we have stabilized those expenses. Now, if I talk about the cap rate, I will just quickly summarize our study as well over here. On a high level basis, our cap rate study would contain figures and it would include macroeconomic factors such as the borrowing cost heading into the valuation date. It includes 5 sales and their calculations that are presented on page 12 of our cap rate study. The sales range is between 5.42% to 7.11%. For now, if the board may scroll up to page number 15, there's a quick description of the cap rate. So for this property, I've looked at the original age and the effective age. The original age is 1911. The effective age comes to 1952. It gives us it puts the property um, at a base cap rate of somewhere between 5.75 to a 6. I have used a base cap rate of 5.75, and then I have further applied premium to the property, as there is no parking associated with the building. This would be an inferior factor as for someone who would be for a potential investor. Further to that, this property is located in a lower socioeconomic area that would require some sort of adjustment made to the premium to the cap rate. So I've applied a premium for that as well. And then on our cap rate table, we have mentioned that it has a suite mix of 6 one-bedroom units and 7 two-bedroom units. So with that, we have applied a cap rate of 6.25%, and our requested value comes to $1,014,619, which I've rounded off to $1,015,000. And that's all from our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Ms. Tang, questions for Mr. Abbas? You are muted.
I'm just wondering if you're able to explain your page 17 of the calculation. So I'm just looking at the average column versus the stabilization.
Yes.
So for the potential market gross rent on the first line, it says average is $144, $119. And on your line 3, it says the average is $144.991. And your stabilized income, again, is a different number, $140,400. So I'm just wondering.
I can talk to it. I can talk to that. So the stabilized income that we have used of $140,400, that comes from the most recent INE, which is the 2022 INE. And the owner or the property management company, they have reported the most recent rents as of $140,400. So typically for rent, we would be using the most recent. We would be using rents from the most recent INE. Typically, we usually see that the rents would be increasing. This is an odd situation where I'm definitely seeing that the rents have gone down from 21 to 22. But to be consistent for using the most recent INE for rents, I have used the rents that were applied in 2022 INE, and those are $140,400.
And I'm just looking at your expenses. So it looks like certain ones you're using the most recent years and certain ones you're using the average. So you're just being selective with whichever methodology.
No, not exact, not being selective. So expenses that would typically fluctuate over a period, like over for different years, we would use an average. But for expenses that would be increasing from year to year or on every year basis, we would be using the most recent because that made most sense. So if you would look at the utility line, which is line 23, you would notice that we are using 24,000, which is lower than 2021. So over here, we could have used the average of 26,000, but typically for expenses that would give us a better idea. Sorry, typically for expense for certain line items that would give us a better idea to use the most recent. We would be using the most recent ones. For office supplies, I have used the average, which is line 17. I've used an average, which is 1,618. If you look at 2022, the office supplies expense comes to 1,734. If you look at the 3-year, the office supplies would fluctuate. It would not be fixed for a certain year, or it would not be increasing from year to year. So that's why we have averaged out those, and it made sense for us to use an average for those expenses.
Do you have any other properties that you have seen so far with total expense ratio of 53.6%? Or do you have any other market studies to support your expense ratio?
We would not have any market study to support this expense ratio. Number one, we would be going by the actual expenses that have been reported for the site. So basically, we are doing site-specific expenses on this property, and typically for properties that have been built in 1911, we would be seeing an expense ratio of around 45 to 55%, or even sometimes greater than that. But that would be an outlier. But 53.6% seems reasonable for a property that is built in 1911.
So I'm just wondering, for your cap rate study, my understanding is that for 2390 McPhillips, the concern is that the city is using the actual rent to calculate the NOI. So I guess others use the market rent to calculate the NOI for 2390 McPhillips. So have you ever seen any of the market studies for similar properties to support your market rent?
Sorry, you're saying that Altus is using market rents to calculate the NOI for 2390 McPhillips?
That's correct.
No, I personally would have not seen, but usually we would be using the market rents to calculate the NOIs and the cap rate.
But you don't have any other market rent to support your subject property rent.
Any other rents for our subject property? No, we would typically be using site-specific rents. Again, I would say to this that we would not have the data, the same data that the city would have. Number one, the same data that the city would have of having the rent comparables for all the properties in the city. Number two, we believe that site-specific rents would show us a true picture of the property itself.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Ms. McFadden, questions for Mr. Abbas?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marks?
Yes, just want a confirmation. Page 17, are those actual numbers utilized throughout that calculation?
Those are all the actual. Are you referring to expenses or rents or both?
Both.
Everything, all the numbers that have been put in on this spreadsheet are all actual numbers that we have got from the INEs that have been provided by the client or the property management company.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Abbas, I have a question on your page 15, please. This relates to the cap rates that you've applied for this property.
Yes, ma'am, sure.
I'm looking specifically at the lower table, which talks about your site-specific adjustments.
Yes.
First of all, just a question about suite mix. Do you see this as a poor suite mix, 6 one-bedrooms, 7 two-bedrooms?
No, I think it's an average. It's a good suite mix for the properties suites.
Okay, so the site-specific then really relates to location and external factors, or?
Location.
Pardon?
Sorry, Madam Chair, to interrupt you. It would, yes, it would be basically on the location and external factors, and the fact that the property does not have any parking.
Okay.
Those two would be my main.
Okay, so my question is this: why a 0.5 adjustment? Why not a 0.25 adjustment? Why not a 0.3? Like, where
Yes.
is that a qualitative? Is that something qualitative that you've done, or is there some science behind the adjustment, or?
So I would say that for this property, I have considered the original age as well of the property and the effective age as well. Again, Ms. Tang agreed with me that yes, this property does have a 1952 as an effective age, but the foundation and the structural age of the property is still from 1911. So I would be using with caution. I've used a base cap rate of 5.75, and then I've applied a 0.25 premium to that based on the fact that it is located in a lower socioeconomic area. And then I've also considered that the property does not have any parking, which would be an inferior factor. and I've applied a 0.25% further premium to keeping in mind that there is no parking, and then the property it's originally built in 1911. The structural is 1911. So if to summarize everything over here, it would be basically on the lower socioeconomic area of the property and the no parking.
Yes, so the adjustment, the quantum of the adjustment, the 0.25 for each factor,
Yes, yes.
that is a qualitative decision that you've taken. You didn't apply a 0.1 adjustment, a 0.2 adjustment, a 0.3 adjustment, it's a 0.25. So that's a decision based on your
That's a
expertise. It's a
decision based
qualitative
on.
decision.
Yes, I do. I do.
Okay, thank you. I have no additional questions, so Mr. Abbas, you indicate you have evidence?
Yes, I do have a rebuttal evidence. I can go over it very quickly once it's distributed to everyone.
Just give us a minute to get there,
All good.
It has been distributed.
okay?
Which
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Abbas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I know the board have heard this a lot of the time. So I would just request the board to turn to page 2 and then onto page 4. This includes sales from city ranging from 3.46% to 5.75% of cap rate. On page 4, we have outlined 2 sales, 727 Sargent and 241 Young, which are low and outside of a typical range for a market like city of Winnipeg. Usually you can get a lower risk bond for these cap rates. And it is being implied that the investors are likely buying an alternative income opportunity and not the income in place for these properties. On page 22, where I'm going to highlight 677 Maryland. The city is using the older sale at 2020, and there's a newer sale, and our calculated cap on the newer sale is 7.11%. That would be everything from my rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Ms. Tang, questions on the rebuttal?
Yes. So I guess for the subject property, it looks like you're using 3-year income, 3-year for the income and for some expenses, and 5-year for the repair and maintenance. For 677 Maryland, with the 7.11% cap rate, is that just based on 1 year income and expense? Or is it
Yes,
based on 3 years or 5 years repair and maintenance as well?
quick second. It would be based off the 1 year that was provided to us, which does follow the IAAO standards.
Are you aware that we're supposed to be treating the subject property and the comparables the same methodology? So which means if you're using the 3-year for the income, 5-year for repair and maintenance, you're supposed to be using the same methodology to calculate the cap rate?
I am aware of the same methodologies.
Okay.
We are using the same methodologies. It's just that for calculating the cap rate, we only had 1 year of income and expense, which again does align with the IAAO standards. It does not say that we cannot use that.
But it's not the same method. The fact you don't have the data doesn't mean that you should be using that sale at all.
Well, I would agree that I would just say and leave it over there that yes, we don't have enough data for that, but the data that was provided to us, we've used that for calculating.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Ms. McFadden, questions on the rebuttal?
I don't have any questions, but is anybody else hearing all that banging?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Marks, questions on the rebuttal?
No, I have no questions on the rebuttal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I have no questions on the rebuttal either. Ms. Tang, I just want to confirm you do not have rebuttal evidence?
No, I don't.
Okay, and Mr. Abbas, I'm confirming that your rebuttal evidence will apply to the remaining items on the docket that you're representing?
Yes, Madam Chair, it would apply to the full docket. And I apologize, the sound is coming from my apartment building. I wasn't aware that there is some construction will be going on this morning.
Okay, okay, we'll work around that. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Tang, would you care for a summation? Oh, no?
Oh, sorry. No, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Abbas?
Yes, I would just quickly summarize, stating that for the subject property, we have used the site-specific expenses and the site-specific rents that would be that should be considered and should be given a higher priority than the comparables, as all the properties do tend to work and operate differently. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abbas. Okay, that will conclude our item number 1. We'll now move to item number 2 and Mr. Charlotte Page. First, we will affirm your evidence, please.
Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Stephen Charlebois Page.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, moving to item number 2. This is file number 24-2576796 Wolseley Avenue. And Mr. Charlebois Page, I'm just confirming that your appeal is with respect to the assessed value.
It is, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. All right, Ms. Tang, you may begin, please.
File number is 24-2576. Roll number is 1208289800. Address is 796 Wolseley Avenue. The assessed value for 2025 is $1,377,000. The building has 3 stories. It was built in 1913. There are 21 suites and 6 outdoor parkings. Page 2 and 3 of my brief shows the subject property photos and locations. And page 5 shows the evaluation. So there's 1 bachelor suite, 13 1-bedrooms, 7 2-bedrooms, and we use the monthly rent of $717.03. Then we use 3.6% vacancy, 58.11% expense ratio, and 5.3% cap rate, and that gives us $1,377,000. Page 6 shows the comparable rent and locations, and 7 and 8 is the cap rate studies. And page 14 to the end of the brief is the subject property income expense information. And that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tang. Mr. Charlebois Page, questions for the assessor?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So first, could I just confirm with you that the value presented today is model generated?
That's correct.
So the comparables, and this might be consistent with the last property, but I'll just confirm with you anyway. So page 6, you got rent comparables. I noted that, the median or whatever measure of central tendency you'd like to use is lower than the average monthly rent for the subject property. Are you suggesting that it should be lower, or is this another case that the price per square foot supports the position?
I think the price per square foot would support the position.
Okay, I just didn't have that. I know you answered that on the first one. I just noted a median of 688, and the subject property at 717. So we can move past that. We're using a very similar effective gross income, so I don't think that's going to be too large in dispute. Did you have a chance to review the actual income and expense data for the subject property?
Briefly.
Would you note that it runs higher than typical?
For the NOI?
For the expenses.
For the expenses?
Yeah.
I think for 2022, it looks like the expense is quite high.
And
And the repair and maintenance looks like it's about 86,000. So that looks like about, I guess I would say about 4,000 per suite. So that's much higher compared to a usual apartment. Normally
For sure.
it ranges between 1,500 to about $2,000 per suite.
I would agree that the R&M for 22 is an outlier. And further that in my brief, I've removed that from my analysis. But you would note that the utilities to this property would run high, and then maybe just a question for you. A property of this age with older sort of utilities inside the building, older windows, and an age of 1913, you'd acknowledge that utilities would typically run higher in an asset of that time period. Is that a fair statement?
I assume so. I mean, we do use an expense ratio of 58.11%, which is higher compared to a regular apartment building. So I do think that the expense ratio has already reflected those expenses.
So you would say that 50, in your experiences in valuation, 58% would be the top end of the range?
That is correct.
Interesting. There's 6 parking stalls for 21 units. Do you think that would detract in value?
I mean, it might have some negative factors, but I'm not too sure. Like I've never done a study to see exactly how much the difference would be.
Okay. And lastly, on your capitalization rate study, obviously we don't have the inputs that go into the model charts. I just noted that the brokerage firms are citing a range of from Collier, CBRE, and Cushman Wakefield of 5 to 6%. You think a property built in 1913 belongs sort of at that 5.3%? You think that would be fair, or that falls into that range?
I mean, I'm not too sure exactly how the cap rate was calculated for the brokers. And the city uses the 3 years historical information prior to the date of sale to stabilize the net operating income and then to determine the cap rate. My understanding is that for the Collier, they do use a 12-month of the net operating income following the date of sale to calculate their cap rate. So that might be one of the reasons why their cap rate is slightly higher compared to what the city has. But I mean, we do have the cap rate study tables to show the cap rate range between 3.46% to about 5.65%. I mean, if there are any other studies that are higher with the similar methodology, we would be more than willing to take a look at.
And so you're saying that all of those sales in the comparables on chart 8 have been reviewed, stabilized over 3 years, adjusted, and derived capitalization rate from?
That's
Is that
correct.
a fair statement?
Yes.
So adjustments were made to the income in those charts?
I'm sorry, what?
Adjustments were made to the income when you derive those capitalization rates?
The cap rate would be the NOI is determined at the date of sale. So if the date of sale is say 2021, then that would be the date for the cap rate.
So 727 Sargent sold an 8-suite apartment in the city of Winnipeg that's 1955 built, and you have it at a 3.46 cap, which is under what you could get a GIC at the valuation date and at the date of sale. Do you think that would be an outlier?
We use the information provided by the owner. If their NOI is lower, then the cap rate will be lower. If the broker has a higher NOI based on the methodology they have, then they would have a higher cap rate based on the same sale price.
But you'd agree, regardless of the methodology applied, a 3.46 cap on a 1955 build 8-suite apartment in the city of Winnipeg, well below the GIC rate, would be an outlier, wouldn't it?
But the NOI we use would also be lower compared to the regular apartment as well.
Okay, sorry.
So
Without
it goes the same. So it's a two numbers to determine the cap rate, to determine the sale price. One is the NOI, one is the cap rate. So if you have a lower NOI with with the same sale price, that would have a lower cap rate. So if our NOI that was provided by the owner is lower compared to what they provided at the time of sale, then our cap rate will be lower. But at the same time, our NOI would also be lower compared to what it provided at the time of sale as well.
So no adjustments might be made for the cases where someone's buying an alternative income opportunity, and you guys are using income in place in those cases.
I'm sorry, I don't quite get your question.
So you've applied an income in place methodology 3 years to that 3.46. Do you think it is likely that someone is buying an alternative income stream or opportunity when they pay that price for that property at that NOI? Because 3.46 is well below the Canadian borrowing rate at the valuation date. It's that would be an outlier in my opinion. I just maybe you disagree, and that's okay. We can move on.
I'm not too familiar with that, so I can't make a comment for that.
Yeah, it is a component of deriving a capitalization rate. Because the income approach is an income investment calculation, right? It's saying what on this income, what is an investor getting in return? So in that mind, you have to be mindful of what the borrowing rate is, what an investor could get in a GIC without a depreciating asset. And typically when you see capitalization rates south of that number, there's potentially something that they're buying an opportunity, but we can move on from that. Those conclude my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. McFadden, questions for the assessor?
I have no questions for the assessor. Thank you.
Mr. Marks, questions for the assessor?
Yes, I have one. Because the building is a 1913 build, have there been any upgrades done to electrical, plumbing, structural since 1913?
I'm just checking my notes here.
Okay.
So we don't have any record to show that there's a permit for the subject property. So our assumption is that they would be keeping the regular required maintenance for the subject property to keep it running.
But not necessarily up to code.
I'm not too sure. But I mean, with the given expense in 2022, it does look like with the $4,000 per suite repair and maintenance, it does look like there might be some sort of upgrade to the property itself.
Okay, so there's no building permits that have been taken out to indicate that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you very much. No further questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, and I have no questions. So Mr. Charlebois-Page, your evidence, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So subject property is a 3.5-story multifamily building built in 1914 were my records, but I understand the assessor presented 1913, so one of those 2 years. Site area is 13,750, 21 units. It's got 1 bachelor, 13 1-bed, and 7 2-bed. Current assessment is $1,377,000 in the residential class. Set aside the cost and sales comparison approach, focused in on the income. Using an EGI of 175,559. It's based on the actual income and expenses adjusted by a vacancy allowance of 3.6% as assessed. I did expense review. Again, that's on page 14. You'll see my income valuation. We are applying an expense allowance of 112,168, or 63.9% of the EGI. It's based on the actual expenses from 2020 to 2022. Please note that we did stabilize the repair and maintenance, which is high for 2022. Our input is 32,434, consistent with 2020 and 2021 when it was a little more flatlined. I would also note that in the expense review that the utilities are quite high. This is consistent with an older building. The street view of the property will tell you that the windows are a little bit older as well. Older utilities, older buildings, utilities are going to run higher naturally. I've applied an NOI of 63,391. There's a attached capitalization rate study, which I won't go to in great detail, but I will just note that there's 6 sales, ranging from 526 to 711. In my report, you'll see my capitalization rate table on page 12. We've stratified them by age range, and this one is built pre-1946. The range in our study goes from 6.1 to 6.6, and I've applied something at the bottom of that range, which is the 6.10 capitalization rate. Applying that to my NOI of 63,391, my proposed revised value is 1,039,000 rounded downward, and that concludes my presentation.
Mr. Charlebois Page. Ms. Tang, questions for the applicant?
Yes. So I guess for the cap rate, so you mentioned that for your cap rate study, sorry, what was the range again?
5.26 to 7.11.
Okay, so would you agree that it is because the NOI that Altus is using is a lot higher compared to what the city has?
I haven't seen the city's capitalization rate. All I see is the chart, so I haven't seen any of the inputs. I couldn't comment on the difference between the two approaches without seeing the study or the inputs.
But given the sale price being the same, would you suspect that the NOI will be lower for us?
I would agree. I think that going into our study, some of our senior multifamily experts would review the income. There are adjustments made. They're outlined in the cap rate study, and you did note it in the prior appeal. Where available, we try and use as many years income and expense as possible. But obviously, our methodology would vary slightly based on what's available and the sales that happen relevant to the valuation date.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the Altus apartment cap rate study chart. I'm looking at some of the calculations with the stabilization income and expenses. I'm looking at the majority of the expenses are less than 50%. And in the brief, I guess we're looking at, Altus brief is looking at, let me just check here again. 63%. I'm just wondering if you have any other studies to support your expense ratios.
No, I think the best review of a subject property for a multifamily asset would be a review of the actual performance of the subject. If we sold this thing at April 1st, 2023, a market participant would review how the performance of the asset under professional management, and it would make its decisions based off of this. So I wouldn't use comparables. I don't think that's best evidence. And to be blunt, this is running high because the building is built in 1913. Utilities are quite high, and that's consistent with, poor exterior seal and a older building with older utilities. And to me, I can't see the the comparison you're trying to draw between the cap rate study and this. Obviously, if we were in a market that had ample amount of sales, you could maybe stratify those sales, but I just don't think there's the amount of sales relevant to really make that kind of an expense sort of derivative based off of the sales. So no, I'd prefer the subject property. I think that's best valuation case and best sort of methodology before the board.
Did you review the market rent for the subject property as well?
I reviewed the rent that was reported by the owner, and in the mailer, they quote themselves at a gross potential income of 180,612.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Marks, questions for the applicant?
Yes, your maintenance for 2022 on your page 17,
Yes,
it was fairly high compared to other years. What
correct.
was the reason for that?
So I don't have an itemized breakdown of what was included in that expense, but if you'll note in the highlighted column there, subject stabilized, in my evaluation before the board today, I used 32,434, and that didn't consider that. The 3-year average you'll see next to that was 49,770, and that's going to be inflated by that 1 year that's higher than typical. So in acknowledging that, I've used the 32,434. And sorry, Mr. Chair, I couldn't give you an itemized breakdown of what that 80,000 is. All I know is that I avoided it from my valuation.
Okay, so you're using the combination of 2020 and 2021 for your expenditures then?
Correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. No further questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I have no questions either. Mr. Charlebois Page, you indicated you have rebuttal.
I'm not going to present the rebuttal evidence in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Tang, just confirming you have no rebuttal?
No, I don't.
Okay, and would you care for summation, Ms. Tang?
No, thank you.
Mr. Charlebois Page?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. That will conclude item number 2. Okay. We'll move to item number 4 on our agenda. This is file number 24-1858, 518 Maryland Street. And Mr. Abbas, I'm confirming that this is an appeal of the assessed value of the property. You're muted.
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tang, when you are ready, please.
File number is 24-1858. Roll number is 1304-1152-300. Address is 518 Maryland Street. The assessed value for 2025 is $1,412,000. The building has 3 stories. It was built in 1927. There are 28 suites and 4 outdoor parkings. Page 5 shows the evaluation. So there are 6 bachelor suite, 22 1-bedroom, and we use a monthly rent of $579.36. And then we use 3.6% vacancy, 59.74% expense ratio, and 5.35% cap rate. And that gives us $1,412,000, which is equivalent to about $50,428 per suite. Page 6 and 7 shows the comparable rent and locations. And the subject property is receiving fundings from the government. So we're showing the CMHC information on page 8 and 9. Page 10 and 11 is the cap rate studies. And page 17 is the income and expense information. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Abbas, questions for the assessor?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you. Ms. Tang, would you agree that a typical housing property would have low quality construction, low end finishes or basic finishes compared to a private market apartment?
I don't think the construction itself is lower, but maybe the finishing itself might be lower compared to the regular apartment.
Okay. And then would you agree that if a housing apartment property is to sell in an open market, it would need to go through significant renovations before it can compete with other market apartments in terms of charging similar rents?
I agree. I mean, this property is on Maryland. In the cap rate study, we also have another 677 Maryland as well, which is just down the street. I think in your brief, you mentioned that the 677 Maryland was sold in 2023 for $2,001,076,000. That's 32 units, and each unit is about 714 square foot, which is equivalent to about 68,000 per unit. And our assessed value for the subject property is about 741 square foot per unit, and it is being assessed for about 50,000 per square foot per unit. So it is already lower compared to the market regular apartment.
To follow up with that, is there any effective age on our subject property?
This one is the same as the effective year built.
So that would be 1927, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and then the sale that you brought up on Maryland, that has an effective age of 1972. So that
Yeah,
would
but
mean
with
that it would have gone through renovations.
I mean, with the 50 years effective year built difference, it's not going to have a 16,000 difference per unit.
That would be your opinion.
That's correct. That'll be my opinion.
Thank you. And my next question would be, so I'm just confirming this. So the model does the model take into consideration that this property is currently operating as a social housing while deriving the cap rate?
I think for the cap rate is treating it as a regular apartment.
Okay, so the model doesn't know that currently it is operating as a social housing, and it could have or it would have low quality finishes, basic outdated finishes, and probably deferred maintenances as well. Do you agree to that?
Well, in my opinion, the subject properties already have about 50,000 per square foot compared to a regular apartment that's 68,000 per unit. Sorry. So in my opinion, that has already been justified.
Okay, my next question to you would be a very similar question. So, do you think that a 5.3 cap rate applied by the model is justified, keeping in mind property's condition, and then the fact that it's below a standard market operating apartment and has an original age of 1927?
I don't think we should just focusing on one point of the calculation. I think we should be looking at the overall value of the property itself. I mean, from an investor's perspective, they're not going to be looking at every single line of the calculation and say, this number is not right and that number is not right. They'll be looking at the total value. And if they think that 50,000 per unit compared to 68,000 per unit down the street is lower, then they would agree to the value. That's just my opinion.
Okay, are you just for a follow-up question, are you saying that an investor who's buying $1 million property would not look at every line item?
I mean, they probably would for the calculation for the NOI, but probably not for the cap rate. They would also be looking at the total asking price as well to determine how much value it is going to be.
And they would also look at the condition of the subject property itself, right?
That is correct.
Okay, those were all my questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Mr. Marks, questions for the assessor?
Yes, please. Once again, have there been any building permits taken out on this particular building due to its age of 1927?
We don't have any record to show that there's a permit.
So there's been no permits taken out on anything since 1927 on this particular property?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Ms. McFadden, questions?
Just to go back to the cap rate, I think your cap rate chart shows that the 80% level is about 5.45. Is it? I think that's correct. The range. So the 80% lies at 5.45. So at 5.35, you're saying that this older building in this inner city neighborhood is falling within 80% of all other buildings in the city.
I guess so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions. So, Mr. Abbas, your evidence, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would request the board to please turn to page 2. You will see a summary of our subject properties, building detail, as well as our requested assessment of $1,155,000. There's a small error over there. I would just like to correct the class code over there. It says 20, but it should have been 40S. So just a minor error that I thought I would highlight it over here.
Thank you.
On the same page, we note that this property was originally built in 1927 and has no effective age assigned to it. On page of, if you scroll down to page 6, there's an exterior photo of the subject property, along with an aerial view showing its location between the two streets of Maryland and McGee. There's a brief property description on page 8, which again tells us about the location of the subject property and also mentions that it has a total of 28 units, including 6 bachelor and 22 one-bedroom units, with only 2 parking stalls reported. Further to that, if I may request the board to scroll down to our income and expense analysis on page 19. So for this property, we are not disputing the NOI. In this case, we are aligned with the rents and the expenses. The case we are only disputing the on this property's case, we are only disputing the cap rate applied by the city, and we are using a cap rate of 6.5%. Our cap rate table would be on page 17. Sorry, if I may request the board to please scroll to page 17. So if you would look at our cap rate table and our cap rate range over here, this property was originally built in 1927. It does not have any effective age applied to it. And Ms. Tang just confirmed that there were no permits pulled for this property, which puts it at a base cap rate of from 6.1 to 6.5, from 6.1 to 6.6. And then based on that, based on the fact that there were no permits and the property is in its original condition with no effective age, I would put the condition to average, below average. Further to that, regarding parking, there are only 2 outdoor parking stalls for 28 units, which is less than 0.25, will be somewhere less than 0.25 percent. For the durability and quality of the income, the property is again a subsidized housing, so it would not have the finishes or the high-end finishes that a typical market apartment would have. We have already established that these housing properties do tend to have deferred maintenances, as they're not generating a profit, but the primary mandate of these housing properties is to house as many people as possible. And then the fact that this property is located in a very lower socioeconomic area, we've applied premiums of 0.5% cap rate, and it gives us an overall cap rate of 6.5. Madam Chair, I've done the same error over here that I did on one of our previous properties yesterday. I've looked at our pre-1946 cap rate range instead of at 6.1. I've looked at it from 6 to 6.6, and I've given a base of 6, and then I've applied premium based on the fact that it's in a lower socioeconomic area, a 0.25. and then a further 0.25 due to the fact that it's a subsidized housing. It has very low outdoor parking stalls, average to below average condition, but that's already captured in its age. So that's how we come to a 6.5 cap rate, and that would be all from my presentation for this property.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Ms. Tang, questions for the applicant?
I think you're muted.
Um, so I'm just wondering, have you ever looked at any of the comparable sales for the subject property for the rent?
Comparable sales for the subject property, no. I Comparable sales for the subject property.
Oh, sorry, comparable rent.
Comparable,
rent.
yeah, okay, okay, yeah, makes more sense. No, I would have not looked at the rents for the subject property. So I've just used typical. I've looked at the typical CMHC rents, and I've adjusted CMHC rents to a 70% because again, it's a subsidized housing, and the rent that I got aligned exactly with city's applied rents. So that's why there was no dispute for the NOI in this case.
So I guess if my calculation was accurate, based on the CMHC rent, I'm just looking at my brief that shows the CMHC information. I guess page 5. It shows that the property is in Zone 1, which is Fort Rogue. The bachelor suite is rent for $822, and one bedroom is rent for $1,079 per unit. So if my calculation is accurate, that would give us a total potential gross rent of $344,040. If I'm applying 70% of the rent because the property is subsidized, and that will still give us $240,000 for the gross potential rent. And if I use that value to minus your expense of $112,000, that will give us about $187,000. Sorry, yeah, that would give us about $135,000. And if I use that NOI to divide by the 6.5% cap rate you're asking for, that gave us $2 million for the valuation.
Thank you for your explanation over here. May I know from where are you getting the information that this property is in this is my first question, that this property is in Zone 1 Fort Rogue? According to my knowledge, and when I looked at it, it was in Zone 3 Midland. And to further answer that, what I've also done is that I've looked at, so let's just refer to your brief over here because you have the tables over, so it would be easier if the board agrees to that.
Go ahead.
So I've also looked at the second table on page 8 of Ms. Tang's brief, where it says private apartment average rents by year of construction and bedroom type. So what I've done is that I've looked at our property. It's pre-1940, and if you look at the rents are $1,653 for a bachelor and $839 for a one bedroom, and it aligns with the above table on Zone 3 Midland, where our property is located. The bachelor in Zone 3 Midland goes for $695, and one bedroom goes for $863. Now I'll come back again to the second table, pre-1940 construction. The rents are $653 and $839. When I use those rents, I get to $268,512. And when I take a 70% of that, I'm coming to $187,958. The city applied $187,657, which was $300 lower than what we calculated. If the board would like to use $187,958, we can use that as well. Or I personally did not see that it was a huge dispute for less than $300. Yeah, less than $300 if my math is correct over here. So that's why. And that is basically my explanation for choosing the rents and the rents that I'm using.
So what was the reason for the 70%, not 80%, not 90%? Is there a reason for that? Or is there a study to show that the social housing would have a typical 70% of the market rent?
Well, I would not have any study to it.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. Ms. McFadden, questions?
Sorry. Just to go back to the relationship between the parking and the cap rate. This is an inner city apartment with primarily totally one bedrooms and bachelor units. It's targeted towards low income people. Do you believe that the lack of parking would really have much of a impact on what an investor was thinking at all? These would normally, the tenants would not be people that were using cars or using cars and needing parking.
I get your question. So typically, so for the valuation purposes, we are using, so we are valuing this apartment as a market apartment. And if an investor has to buy this apartment and put it out in a market for tenants and not subsidized tenants, out of 28 units, I still feel like even if you take a 50% of that, I think at least 10 to 12 tenants would be needing some sort of parking. I mean, again, I don't have any study to back that data. But out of 28 units in that building, even if 5 people minimum, I think of a minimum of 5 people, even if a minimum of 5 people would need a parking, the building would not be able to accommodate that. Again, on our cap rate table, yes, I have mentioned that there are only 2 stalls for 28 units, which is insufficient. But our main focus on the cap rate table and the reasons that I've applied a premium was that it's in a lower socioeconomic area, major factor, and then it's a subsidized housing, major factor. And then yes, average, below average condition, and insufficient parking are are definitely factors, but I would consider parking some sort of minor factor compared to what other factors we have over here.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Ms. McFadden. Mr. Marks, questions for the applicant?
No, my question's been asked and answered. Thanks very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marks. And Mr. Abbas, I just am confirming that your rebuttal evidence presented previously would apply to this matter also?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Chang, no rebuttal evidence from you?
No.
Okay, thank you. And would you like summation, Ms. Chang?
No, thank you.
Mr. Abbas?
I think I'm good for this one, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, that will conclude item number 4. Before we start with item number 5, does anyone want a 5-minute break or should we continue on?
Can I
Madam
use the
Chair-
bathroom?
Pardon
Sorry.
me?
Can I use the bathroom?
Of course you can. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break if that's okay. How about we resume at 10:20? Thank you. I'd like to call our meeting back to order. We'll continue on with our agenda with item number 5. File number 24-2094. This is 665 Maryland Street. And Mr. Abbas, I'm just confirming that this is an appeal of the assessed value of the property.
Yes, Madam Chair, I confirm.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tang, then you may begin with your evidence.
File number is 24-2094. Row number is 130502051000. Address is 665 Maryland Street. The assessed value for 2025 is $1,441,000. The building has 3 stories. It was built in 1972. It has 18 suites and 3 outdoor parkings. And page 5 shows the evaluation. So there are 14 one-bedrooms, 4 two-bedrooms. We use a monthly rent of $744.93. Then we use 3.6% vacancy, 53.08% expense ratio, And that gives us $72,779 for the NOI. The subject property reports a 72,118 NOI after adding the mortgage and amortization back, which supports the model NOI. Then we use a 5.05% cap rate, and that gives us $1,441,000. Page 6 and 7 shows the comparable rent and locations. And the last page of my brief shows the subject property income and expense. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. King. Mr. Abbas, questions for the assessor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions would be related to the information provided on page 5. Ms. Tang, may I ask, how is the city coming up with the 53.08% expense ratio for this property?
I guess depends on the condition and the age and the location of the property it is in. Like I mentioned, the NOI for the model is $72,779. For the subject property, after we're adding back the mortgage and the amortization, is about $72,118. So which is really close to what we have for the model.
Okay. Again, does the city consider actual expenses reported by the owners on their income and expense mailers usually? Is that a usual practice for expenses?
We'll be looking at the overall net operating income. Like I mentioned previously, we don't just look at one line, we look at the overall value. So the NOI reported by the owner is pretty similar to what we have as a model to calculate the total value. So we just leave it the way it is.
Okay, so just to follow up on that, well, NOI is a final value, right? To get to the NOI, you would have to look at other components that gives you the final NOI number, which would be rents and the different expenses. That's okay. My third question would be, again, related to your expenses. If you look at the actual expenses that have been reported, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the actual expenses that were provided by the property management company or the owner. The range for their expenses is from 92,000 to 105,000 from year 2020 to year 2022. So for the 3 years, these are their reported expenses. And the expenses that the city has applied are 82,000. So would you have any say? Why is the city applying such a low expense ratio or expenses?
Looks like their income is also higher compared to what the city has.
But the dollar amount, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So for 2022, it looks like they're reporting 178,000 for the rent, for the potential rent, and the city is using 155,000 for the effective gross income. So the actual rent is a lot higher compared to what we have as well. So just because their expense is higher, compared to what we have, their income is also much higher compared to what we have as well.
Okay. And I might just have one more question. Just bear with me.
I'm sorry, Mr. Abbas, are your questions?
Madam Chair, I might have just one more question. Just give me 1 minute, please.
Yeah, for sure.
So I would again jump, give me 1 second, on your page where you have provided rent comparables. Are all those rent comparables actual or estimated? Would you know about that?
What do you mean by submitted?
Estimated, sorry.
Oh, estimate. Oh, is the actual that's reported by the owner.
Okay.
Or the management company.
Oh, okay, perfect. Those were all my questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Ms. McFadden, questions for the assessor?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marks, questions for the assessor?
And I have no questions this time, thank you.
Okay, nor do I, so thank you very much, and sorry for my coughing. Mr. Abbas, your evidence, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 2, you will see a summary of our subject properties building details, as well as our requested assessment of $1,228,000. I would highlight again that the property is built in 1972 and no effective age has been assigned to it. If we scroll down to page 6 and 7, you will see some aerial photos of the location and of the neighborhood. And on page 8, I have an exterior photo of our subject property. On page, I would just request the board to come to page 16, please, where we have provided our income and expense analysis. For the purpose of this report, we are applying a potential market gross rent of $173,640 based on the actual stabilized income of the subject property. And after taking out a vacancy allowance and adding for laundry and parking, we come to an effective gross income, which is line 13 of $171,731, which is based on the actual expenses reported by the owner and is higher than what the city is applying for this property. For the expenses, we are disputing the assessor's expense allowance of $82,333 or 53.1% of their gross income. We are applying an expense allowance of $98,000 or 57.1% of the effective gross income based on the actual stabilized expenses of the subject property. If you would look at the 3 years income and expense mailers, income and expense provided, if you just look at the expenses, you would see that our $98,000 lies within the range for their total expenses for the 3 years from 2020 to 2022. And the expense ratio that comes out for those 3 years is 59.1 for 2020, 52.8 for 2021, and 59.5 for 2022. So our expense ratios aligns with that. Our expense ratio is 57.1%, which gives us an NOI of 73,672, and I do agree that our NOIs are quite similar to what the city has. Further to that, we have applied a 6% cap rate. And if I now may ask the board to please scroll to page 14, and I apologize, you would have to change the orientation of page 14 to look at the cap rate table. So our property is built in 1972, which would put it in the third range of 1970 to 1989, 5.5 to 6.25. Further to our base cap rate of that, we would consider and mention that this property is located in a lower socioeconomic area. So there would be a premium applied to the base cap rate of 0.25. And then if I look at the suite mix for this property is has a heavy suite mix of one unit bedrooms. About, if I could quickly give me 1 second, I think about 77% of the units are one bedroom for this property. So based on that below average suite mix and the fact that the parking is less than 1-to-1. So over here on my table, it says that there are 10 outdoor parking stalls, but I would just like to correct that based on the INE that I have attached on this document as well, which is on page 27, the owners are reporting that there are only 6 outdoor parking stalls, which again is lower and less, and it gives us a less than 1-to-1 ratio. So keeping all those factors in mind, we've applied a 6% overall cap rate for this property. And that gives us our final value of $1,227,875, rounded off to $1,228,000. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Ms. Tang, questions for the applicant?
Yeah, so I guess I'm just looking at the cap rate studies, 345 Talbot, 677 Maryland, 150 Hendon. They all have a similar effective year build of about 1970 or 1972. And those three properties has 48.2% expense ratio, 47.8% expense ratio, and 48.4% expense ratio. Or I'm just wondering if you're able to explain why the subject property has a 57.1% expense ratio according to your calculation.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I already went over that, but I'll explain that again. So we are looking at site-specific expenses because these are apartment buildings. Sorry. Each every building operates differently, would have different issues going into that. We are using the actual expenses that have been reported. You're not estimating any of the expenses over here. All the expenses that we have applied are actual, and we have provided a 3-year stabilization for these expenses as well. And that's how we're getting to a 57.1% expense ratios, which aligns with the 3 years of expense data that we have for this property.
But you're not looking at the market information?
We would definitely look at the market information as well, but in this case, we would give priority, or I would say more weightage to the site specific information, at least for the expenses, because every building would have different expense. Every building would be engineered differently, would be constructed differently, would have different issues going into it. And these are older buildings, not that old, but again, these buildings are from 1970s with no effective age. So I think using site-specific expenses would give us a better idea. And following to that, if a potential investor or a potential owner would want to buy a property, he would focus more on how the building is performing itself and would look at the expenses that are being incurred by the building itself rather than the market.
So I'm just wondering, so your NOI is 73,000, which is slightly higher compared to what the city has. So are you suggesting when the city assessing the property, we should be using the actuals that is higher compared to what we already have?
I would suggest we are suggesting a 73,672 NOI, and that's what we are getting using the actual rent and the actual expenses, whereas the city is not using an actual expenses. If the city tends to use the actual NOI of our reported NOI, which is based off the actual expenses, then I would say that the city should also be using actual expenses.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. Mr. Marks, questions?
No questions for me at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. McFadden?
I have no questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Abbas, I am looking at your page 16 R&M line, line number 27.
Yes, ma'am.
I do see you stabilized. Is that because the R&M in 2022 was significantly higher than previous years?
So, Madam Chair, if you scroll down one page further on page 17, you would see that we have stabilized our R&Ms based on 5 years, because R&Ms R&M line item would involve a lot of different expenses that gets thrown into that account. So that's why we would be using 5 years of expense information if we have. So for this property, we do have 5 years of our total R&Ms provided to us. So we have taken an average of the 5 years, and the average comes down to $27,004, and that's what we have used to be more consistent with the R&M.
The 2022 R&M does seem to be quite an outlier compared to the 4 previous years. Is it possible that there's some capital in there? I mean, there's data in this chart.
For sure. Your question is valid. The thing is that I don't have a breakdown, so I cannot tell if it would be capital expenditure or if it would be further, or just a year where you ended up doing a lot more than you would be doing previously. I cannot speak to that, Madam Chair, because I don't have a breakdown over here.
Okay, I'm wondering if that is the case because we can't really tell, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I have no additional questions then. Mr. Abbas, I do note that you have the rebuttal evidence that you would introduce for this property as previous.
Yes, Madam Chair, I would just like to carry forward the rebuttal for this property as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Tang, no rebuttal for you.
No, thank you.
Okay, and would you care for summation, Ms. Tang?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas.
I will just quickly summarize that for this property, and for all the properties we've discussed before as well. So we've used site-specific expenses for expense ratios, and for expenses, it's site-specific expenses should be used because every property is engineered differently, constructed differently, and operates differently based on how the owner or the property management company are keeping up with the upgrades and the renovations on these properties. So to use an estimated or market expenses or market ratio would we might not see the accurate picture or accurate true picture of what the property or how the property is behaving. And second to that, I would just repeat my point that if a potential buyer is coming in for this building, they would be provided with the actual INEs, and they would only be looking at the actual INEs for their expenses and their NOI. That's all from my summary, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Okay, that will conclude item number 5. And we will go to item number 6 on our agenda. This is file number 24-2296, 351 Victor Street. And Mr. Charlebois, I am just confirming that this is an appeal of the assessed value of the property.
That's correct, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Tang, you may begin with your evidence on item number 6, please.
File number is 24-2296. Row number is 130404830000. Address is 351 Victor Street. The assessed value for 2025 is $1,465,000. Again, the building had 3 stories. It was built in 1911. There are 19 suites and 12 outdoor parkings. Page 5 shows the evaluation. So there are 2 1-bedrooms, 9 2-bedrooms, 6 3-bedrooms, and 2 4-bedrooms. And we use an average monthly rent of $887.55. Then we use a 3.6% vacancy, 59.44% expense ratio, and 5.4% cap rate. And that gives us $1,465,000. Page 6 shows the comparable rent and locations. Page 7 and 8 shows the CMHC information. And page 16 to the end of brief shows the subject property income and expense information. And that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tang. Mr. Charlotte-Wapage, questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So could I confirm with you first that the value presented today is model generated?
That's correct.
Are you aware that this is subsidized housing?
Yes.
Okay. So again, I'll note that even your guys' ranging, I think, to 545, the brokers from 5 to 6 for low-rise assets. Do you think a building built in 1911 that's rent geared to income structure belongs in the bottom half of the broker range or within that 80th percentile of your range?
I think so.
Okay. Does the model adjust these properties for being social housing?
I think we adjust the rent and the expense to a lower or a poor condition to reflect the lower rent for the subject property.
But the model would be comparing this to market apartments from a capitalization rate perspective. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And none of the rent comparables you provided in your chart are social housing?
No, those are just regular apartment.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Charlebois-Page. Mr. Marks, questions for the assessor?
Yes, this particular building is built in 1911.
That's correct.
Okay. That being said, have there been any upgrades to the structure since then?
Um, It looks like that there's a fire damage for the property in 2012, and when we at the time of the inspection, we noticed that the building is well maintained, but we don't have any other permits for the properties itself.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Ms. McFadden, questions for the assessor?
No, my question's been asked and answered. Thank you.
Thank you, and I have no questions either. So on to you, Mr. Charlebois-Page.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the subject property is a 3-story multifamily building built in 1911. This is owned and operated under a rent geared to income structure. It is subsidized housing. Subject property has a site area of 11,802 square feet, 19 units comprised of 2 1-beds, 9 2-beds, 6 3-beds, and 4 2. Sorry, I think that's 2 4-beds. I might have wrote that down incorrectly. My apologies. Current assessment is $1,465,000 in the residential class. Set aside cost and sales, focusing in on the income approach. For this property, obviously the income reported is well below market. So in this case, we've accepted the adjustment made to this, the CMHC rents adjusted downward for the fact that this is rent geared to income property. We've used the same EGI as the assessment authority in this case, which is 195,076. And where we start to sort of separate on in terms of this valuation is with the expense allowance. 3 years income and expense provided here. You'll see the total expenses ranging from 126 to 137, 126,000 to 137,000, and that's from 22 and 23. In my reconciliation of value, I've used a total expense allowance of 131,997, or 67% of the EGI. And that's again based on the actuals. The next page has a breakdown of the R&M for the site. Granted that it's quite high, that's not atypical for a building again of this age and this rent geared to income structure, social housing. But you can see these are not an anomaly. It's not 1 year that's standing out like a sore thumb. On page 20, if you'll turn that page around, you'll see from 18 to 22, that's typical for the function of this building. In terms of my capitalization rate study, or my capitalization rate, I've applied a base rate of 625. There's a chart there. I'll get the page 17, stratified by age again, and then determining site specific factors. So my base cap was 625, and I've added 5% capitalization rate adjustment for the fact that this building is subsidized housing. Its age is quite old. It's built on wood frame construction, and the parking is under 1-to-1. Again, all of those factors considered, this should be at the top end of the range, and that's where I've stratified it. So in saying that, my reconciliation of value on page 19 is 935,000 rounded, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Charlebois-Page. Ms. Tang, questions for the applicant?
I'm wondering if you have done any studies to compare a regular apartment buildings versus a social housing properties to show that a cap rate adjustment is required?
Not specifically have I conducted a study, but if you'll bear with me, if you scroll up my brief to pages 12, or starting on page 12 and then going down through 14, what we can do is rely on board decisions and excerpts from prior matters that the boards have decided on. So if we look there at the top of page 13, you'll see in an MMB order regarding low investment grade apartments. There's an excerpt there from the appraisal journal in 1996, where they speak about the added risk to an asset that functions under this sort of structure. They highlight several factors: high operating expense ratio that we see here, low net income, which we see here, negative in fact, variability of the income stream, and there is tons of language there. And in the past, the board has decided in adding premiums. And to be quite frank, a study from a market side perspective would be difficult because these assets don't typically sell. It's my understanding that the need for this asset, and this is just, again, there's no highest and best use analysis done by either party here. The need for this building, as I understand it, there's no excess of supply of community housing. In fact, I would almost anecdotally state the opposite, that there's probably more demand. So, in light of that, it's a market apartment, or it shouldn't be valued as a market apartment. It should be adjusted for the fact that it's run as rent geared to income, and that'd be my opinion on that.
Are you aware that there has been a more recent municipal board decision regarding to the social housing properties in Winnipeg?
Yeah, I know in terms of which is it in your brief or my
No,
evidence?
it's not. It's on Sutton Street. I'm just
Nope.
wondering if you're aware of that.
I've not read that decision in its entirety.
Okay. Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Ms. McFadden, questions?
Yes, just looking at your cap rate, if we look back to the last property that you presented, number 2, which
Yep.
was a building built in 1913, and it had you gave it a cap rate of 6.1. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit why that's a pretty substantial difference in cap rates.
For sure, Madam Chair. In this case, when contemplating a capitalization rate, I'm thinking of what is the durability of this income from a market perspective. If I'm a purchaser and I buy this, the risk factors are exceptionally higher in being rent geared to income. There's typically larger deferred maintenance, typically a lower quality of construction that requires more year-over-year maintenance. That'd be substantiated in this case if you look at sort of the R&M from the last 5 years. Bluntly speaking, the difference between this one is it's slightly older, wood frame construction, and it's operating as rent geared to income. And for those various factors that are outlined, and I think I just went over on page 12, sort of some of those factors considered, I increased it by 0.50% in this case from a base of 625.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Ms. McFadden. Mr. Marks, questions?
No, my question's been asked and answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I have no additional questions either. Mr. Charlebois-Page, I note that your rebuttal evidence presented previously would apply to this.
No, Madam Chair, I didn't present any, and I
That's
won't on
correct,
this.
you did not.
No, but I will take summary, and after you've asked Ms. Tang if she has rebuttals.
So no rebuttal for this item either then, okay.
No, thank you.
Ms. Tang, summation,
No, thank you.
Mr. Charlebois Page.
Thank you. And I'll just keep this brief. I would just ask the board to contemplate the higher expenses and the higher cap rate put forward. This is a 114-year-old building, wood frame. It serves the house people from a lower socioeconomic profile. And I would just ask the board to contemplate all that when they make their decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That will conclude item number 6. So thank you, Mr. Charlebois Page.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. I'm going to jump off. Bye now.
You too.
Have a good one.
All right, going back to the final item on our agenda, this is file, item number 8, file number 24-2552-724 Wellington Avenue. And Mr. Abbas, I'm confirming that this is an appeal of the assessed value of the property.
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tang, then you may begin.
There is a non-compliance issue for the property.
Do you have that in your brief, Ms. Tang?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do see that. Sorry about that. All right, if you could just introduce the property and go right to the non-compliance issue, please.
Okay. File number is 24-2552. Roll number is 1303-1735000. Address is 724 Wellington Avenue. The assessed value for 2025 is $1,525,000. The building has a, sorry, do I need to introduce the
Let's
property?
go straight to the burden of proof, please. Non-compliance.
Okay, so if you turn to page 3 of my brief, that shows the letter for the income expense that we send out to the owner. And the address is at Unit 216, 3600, looks like Camp Road. And page 4 shows the tracking information, and page 5 shows the signature that the letter has been received. And page 6 also shows the assessment notice that shows that the address we sent to the owner is the same as the mailer that we send out to the owner as well. So we're asking for non-compliance for the property since we didn't receive the income expense information for 2022.
Thank you. Mr. Abbas, questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, we don't have any questions.
Thank you. Ms. McFadden?
No question.
Thank you. Mr. Marks?
And none for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no questions. The panel will go in camera to discuss the matter of the non-compliance. Thank you very much. The board has considered the assessor's request that the burden of proof be placed on the applicant for non-cooperation, and on the basis of the evidence provided has granted that request. So that means, Mr. Abbas, that the burden of proof shifts to you, and I would ask you to please introduce the property, please, and present your evidence first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on page 2, you will see a summary of our subject properties, building
Yeah,
details.
could you please read in the role and the address?
Yes,
like,
okay.
From the very beginning.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Okay. On page 2, we will see the property's address is 724 Wellington Avenue. The roll number as it stands is 1303-1735000. Building's age is original age is 1912, with an effective age applied to it as of 1962. The property has 8 bachelor units, 4 one-bedroom, and 8 two-bedroom units. The 2025 realty assessment is pegged at $1,525,000, and our requested assessment today is $1,176,000. On page 6, I have presented an exterior photo of our subject property, as well as an aerial view followed by that on the following page. Now, if I may request the board to scroll to page 15, I have provided my income and expense analysis over there. And the board, please let me know once you are on page 15.
Go ahead, Mr. Abbas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for the purpose of this report, we are applying a potential market gross rent of $182,274, or $759 per suite, based on the actual stabilized income of the subject property. For vacancy allowance, we are applying a vacancy allowance of 7.6%, based on the actual performance of the subject property, which is reported from year 2020 to 2022. For following that, we come to an effective gross income of 182,274. And regarding expenses, we have applied. Sorry, give me 1 second. So we are disputing the expenses applied by the assessor at $89,609, or 53.1%. We are applying an expense allowance of $108,746, or 59.7% of effective gross income, based on the actual stabilized expenses of the subject property. This gives us an NOI of 73,528, and after applying a cap rate of 6.25%, we come to a value of $1,176,452, which rounded off would be, sorry, Madam Chair, just give me 1 second. Yeah, if we round that off, we would be asking for the value of $1,177,000. Now, if I may request the board to scroll up to page 13, where I have presented our cap rate analysis. So, just quickly, I would like to mention one thing before I go into the explanation of our cap rate. This property is again in a lower socioeconomic area. I've not mentioned that over here. That's an error or a typo, but I would speak to that. So the original age of the subject property is 1914, and with an effective age of 1962. That puts the property in the second range of 5.75 to 6.50 of our cap rate ranges. Further to that, we see that this property has a wood frame construction. This property has a less than 1-to-1 parking ratio and is located in a lower socioeconomic area. So I have applied a 0.5 premium to our base cap rate of 5.75, and the premium comprises of a 0.25 adjustment made for the property to be located in a lower socioeconomic area, and further to that, a 0.25 is added as the parking is less than 1-to-1, and the property is a wood frame construction, which would not be typically considered a high quality construction. And that would be all for my presentation, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Ms. Tang, questions for Mr. Abbas?
Sorry, I'm just wondering if you're able to explain the adjustment from, I guess, between 5.75 to 6.5. Like, how did you determine the 6.25% cap rate? Like, what factors impact the adjustment?
Yeah, so 5.75 would be our base with the effective age of 1962. And then as this property is located in a lower socioeconomic area, there would be a 0.25% adjustment made based on that. And then a 0.25 adjustment would be made as this property would have less than 1-to-1 parking ratio and is wood frame construction, which is typically considered a lower quality finish, I would say, in my opinion.
Okay. And do you have any studies to compare an apartment with parking versus an apartment with no parking to see what their cap rate is?
I do not have any study for that.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Marks, questions for Mr. Abbas?
No questions from me at this time, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. McFadden?
No, I have no question. Thank you.
Thank you, and nor do I. So Ms. Tang, to your evidence, please.
Madam
Oh,
Assessor, you're on mute.
So, sorry, so do I still need to start from the beginning?
No, it's already been introduced, but you can just talk to us about your front page.
Okay. Okay, so the property at 724 Wellington, the building had 3 stories. It was built in 1912 with an effective year built of 1962. There is a permit for the building for the renovation. It was for 2011, and we inspect the property in 2013. At the time of the inspection, after the inspection, we determined that the effective area built should be adjusted to reflect the condition of the property. Page 7 and 8 shows the subject property photos and locations, and page 10 shows our evaluation. So we use, so there are 8 bachelor suite, 4 1-bedrooms, 8 2-bedrooms, and then we use a monthly rent of $730.09. Then again, we use a 3.6% vacancy, 53.05% expense ratio, and 5.2% cap rate. And that gives us $1,525,000. Page 11 shows the comparable rent to support our model rent. And page 13 is the cap rate study. And page 19 is the income and expense information for the property. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Abbas, questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, just a couple of questions. So, Ms. Tang, when I look at your expense ratio, you're applying the same expense ratio that was earlier applied. The model is applying the same expense ratio. Is there any study provided that would say that a 53.5% expense ratio applied justifies the subject property?
I don't have it in my brief, but according to the Altus cap rate study, the expense ratio ranges between 33.8% to about 48.4%. So we applied 53.05%. So it's already lower compared to Altus's study expense ratio. So I think that would support the expense that we have.
Okay. And then would you consider the location of this property to be in a lower socioeconomic area?
I agree, but with the higher expense ratio compared to the Altus's study, the average for Altus's study expense ratio is about 43.64%, and the city is at 53.05%. So that's almost 10% higher compared to what the market expense ratio is. So we do think that our model has already reflected the fact is in a lower, at a less average location.
Would you agree that crime rates, if crime rates are higher in that neighborhood, would that affect the value of the property?
What do you mean by the prime rate?
Sorry, I'm talking about the crime rates.
Oh, crime rate. I think the model is pretty accurate, reflecting to the rent. If you're looking at my brief, the last page of my brief that shows the income and expense, it looks like their total income is their gross effective income is 174,000, and our model gross effective gross potential rent, effective gross income is 168,000. So our effective gross income is lower compared to what the actual is. So that has already reflect the location, and there's a high crime and things like that.
But a blighted neighborhood or a low end neighborhood would we would typically see a higher maintenances on those sorts of buildings in that neighborhood. Would you not agree with that?
I agree. That's why, like I mentioned, our expense ratio is about 10% higher than the average expense ratio for the market study applied by the Otis group. So I do agree with that.
Okay, and then my final question would be, by looking at I'm on page 7 of your brief. By looking at the exterior photo of the subject property, would you agree that it is still in its original condition?
That's correct.
Okay, that would be all of my questions, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Mr. Marks, questions for the assessor?
Yes, one regarding the permit that was done in, I believe, 2012. What work was completed on that permit?
Okay, I'll have to take a look. Mm, mm. So it looks like there is a in-suite repair and replacement for the entrance, electrical, bathroom, windows, kitchens, flooring, doors, finishing, painting, cleaning, common areas, exterior, hallway, stairs, basement, plumbing, heating, electrical. Looks like quite a bit of work has been done to the property in
Was there a value attached to the final product on that?
I'm sorry?
Was there a value attached to the work done after it was completed?
Like the permit value?
Not the permit value, actual value.
So our assessed value?
No,
What do you mean?
the amount that the contractor was paid out at the end of the
Oh.
day.
I don't have that information. The declared construction value is about 500,000.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Ms. McFadden?
I have no questions, thank you.
Thank you, and I have no questions either. Mr. Abbas, your rebuttal will carry forward for this matter also. And would you like summation on this property?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm good.
Thank you, Ms. Tang, summation?
No, thank you.
Thank you. All right, that will conclude item number 8. So with that, we have heard all items scheduled today. This hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much, Ms. Tang and Mr. Abbas, for your presentations today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
You too.
You as well.
You.
Bye.